Hey everyone, welcome back to all my listeners. This is episode number 17 of season 8. Today is Wednesday, April 26th, 2023. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. Now, all right, you guys, hope you guys are hanging in there this week. It is the last week in April, so I know we have lots more to look forward to in May. Now, I know I had a fantastic weekend. I hope you guys did as well. I went down to downtown Chicago, went to the Art Institute of Chicago, saw this incredible Salvador Dalí exhibition that I was dying to see. It's called The Image Disappears. So if any of you guys are located out here in Chicagoland like me, it is an incredible, incredible exhibit to make time for. It's a small, intimate little gallery, but it's incredible, fantastic. And of course, the Art Institute itself is huge, so you could literally spend the entire day there. It was another cold and windy day in Chicago, so getting there was just wonderful to see all the flowers and trees in bloom, but it was quite chilly. Regardless, I loved it, had a great time. Need to go into the Art Institute much, much more, hopefully in the summer months. So anyways, I just wanted to share that I had a great time. So I wanted to let you guys know, of course, another gentle reminder that Anchor has become Spotify for podcasters. Incredible platform. I know I've used Spotify for, at least a decade or so to create my own playlists for music and stuff like that and follow all the hot new artists that are available for us on Spotify. So just want to let you all know that now this particular podcast of mine, Paint the Medical Picture, is on Spotify for podcasters. So hopefully you guys can start following the podcast on Spotify as well. My goal is to reach 500 new followers on Spotify. I'm already halfway there since their takeover took effect about a month ago. So I'm on my way, so I just need some more supporters, please. I'm trying to reach my goal of at least 500 here on Spotify, so I'd appreciate all of your continued support. Now, let's go ahead and dive into today's episode. Of course, it's the last Wednesday of the month, and as you know by now, in my 8th season, hopefully you all know, the last Wednesday of the month is dedicated to my Newsworthy fraud, waste, and abuse highlights for the month. So, for the month of April. And of course, I'll be spotlighting some of those from the month's criminal and civil enforcement cases that I find newsworthy. And then in my compliance tips and my compliance recommendations in Trusty Tip, I wanted to dive into the latest, the 4th CBR for the year on hospice. And of course, I'm going to go ahead and round out today's episode with the remarkable quote on creativity by, of course, Salvador Dalí. Right? I just saw that exhibit and I found this quote and it was just perfect for my spark today. Now, if you guys have checked me out on LinkedIn, you know I'm all about compliance and protecting our physicians and our valued healthcare professionals when it comes to the business of medicine. I hope this week with me brings you enough to take back to your organizations, to want to dive in deeper, to use my tips and best practices to ensure success. I hope this podcast will help you boost the quality of documentation capture and improve your coding accuracy as you help all your providers paint the medical picture. If you like what you're hearing, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss another episode. Please write in a review and kindly drop me a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and start following this podcast on Spotify, please. I'd really love your support on Spotify as well. And as always, a friendly disclaimer. Remember, I'm bringing you the news, current healthcare industry news, my compliance tips and my compliance recommendations based on my over 12 years of experience in front office, in back end, in coding, and in billing for multi-specialty physicians, in compliance, and in auditing for both E&M and surgical operative reports. These are my opinions alone and are not to be construed as legal advice. Today's episode is sponsored by Advanced Coding Services, a leading medical billing and medical coding school in the United States. Whether you're just starting out or a seasoned professional, our training equips you with the tools and support you need to advance your career. Our medical billing and coding school meets your needs worldwide online or in person with one-on-one support throughout your training. We are committed to helping our alumni and credentialed medical community in keeping up their certifications by offering various avenues for acquiring your continuing education units. In addition to our Mastering the Business of Medicine retreats offered several times throughout the year in different parts of the country, we now offer memberships. You can conveniently earn your CEUs by attending our exclusive members-only webinars. Since our aim is to nurture and grow the careers of individuals who work in the business of medicine, we call our member area the Apple Orchard. Advanced coding services, educate, nurture, inspire, reaching back with a hand up. So let's get into Newsworthy, the month's fraud, waste, and abuse cases. The month of April saw a whopping 42 cases as of the recording of this episode. Early April saw a pharmacist pleading guilty to submitting fraudulent claims to Medicare for prescription drugs that were never dispensed to patients. This man also co-owned the pharmacy he worked at. He created fake patient profiles in the pharmacy's digital filing system and added fraudulent prescription medication entries to these fictitious patient files that duplicated prescriptions for medications provided to real patients of the pharmacy. He then submitted false and fraudulent claims for the drugs added in the fictitious patient files that had never been dispensed, billing Medicare for the fraudulent prescriptions in the names of real patients of the pharmacy. Between January 2017 and June 2022, he allegedly caused Medicare to pay the pharmacy between approximately $600,000 and over $1 million as a result of the submission of false and fraudulent claims. This man pleaded guilty to one count of healthcare fraud and is scheduled to be sentenced. He faces a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. Early April also saw a former hospice care owner convicted of defrauding Medicare. A federal jury returned a guilty verdict against the former hospice care owner for one count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and 3 counts of healthcare fraud following a trial that lasted almost 1 month. She was the owner of a hospice care corporation that was purported to provide hospice services. Through evidence presented at trial, jurors learned that from approximately 2009 through 2017, over 24 patients were placed on hospice by this hospice care corporation without meeting the criteria required by Medicare. During the time period that the patients were on hospice and under the care and supervision of this hospice entity, none of them had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. In fact, many of the patients themselves who are still alive and thriving many years later, as well as family of other patients, testified that they never knew that they had been placed on hospice. The testimony revealed that while on hospice care, many of the patients were living normal lives, and although most of them did have some medical conditions, none had been diagnosed as being terminally ill. The fraudulent claims submitted to Medicare and reimbursed to the Hospice Corporation resulted in a loss of approximately $1.5 million to Medicare. As the owner of the Hospice Care Corporation, she faces a sentence of up to 20 years in prison on the conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud charge, up to 10 years in prison on the healthcare fraud charges, 3 years of supervised release, as well as a fine of up to $250,000 to Medicare. Mid-April saw a man sentenced in federal court to 41 months in prison following his earlier guilty plea to buying and selling more than 2.6 million Medicare beneficiary identification numbers, along with other personal identifiers. In one of the first prosecutions brought under the Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act of 2015, also called MACRA, this man was sentenced to 41 months imprisonment following his guilty plea to one count of conspiracy to violate MACRA by buying and selling beneficiary identification numbers. Among other things, MACRA makes it illegal to buy, sell, or distribute without lawful authority Medicare or Medicaid beneficiary numbers. As part of his plea, he admitted that he and his co-conspirators used data mining and social engineering techniques to collect Medicare beneficiary information, which he then advertised and sold online. The trafficked information included beneficiary names, addresses, dates of birth, social security numbers, and Medicare beneficiary identification numbers. According to the indictment, some of the illicit transactions involved foreign actors, including sellers in the Philippines and buyers in Egypt. Late April saw a pediatrics healthcare practice has agreed to pay $3 million to resolve allegations that it violated the False Claims Act by engaging in fraudulent billing activities between January 2017 and May 2021 with regards to pediatric in-home health, personal care, and related services. From 2017 and continuing through May 2021, this pediatrics healthcare practice billed its state Medicaid for reimbursements for in-home healthcare services for pediatric patients who were actually hospitalized at the time the in-home services were billed. They allegedly routinely billed the state Medicaid for home health services that were not actually provided. The civil settlement includes the resolution of claims brought under the QTAM, or whistleblower provisions of the False Claims Act, against the pediatrics practice. The claims resolved by this settlement are allegations only, and there has been no determination of liability. Of course, there were also many of the other usual suspects, like even more opioid pills galore, kickbacks, bribery schemes, a huge COVID-19 vaccination card scheme, and money laundering. But I wanted to pay particular attention to 3 cases involving nurses. First, there's a case involving a man working as a licensed practical nurse, or LPN, who has been indicted and arraigned in connection with allegations that he physically and verbally assaulted an elderly dementia patient at the rehabilitation and skilled nursing facility where he worked. His employment has since been terminated. His nursing license has been suspended as a result of this incident. He was arraigned on charges of assault and battery on an elder or disabled person, witness intimidation, and threatening to commit a crime. These charges are allegations only, and he is presumed innocent until proven guilty. The second case involves a former emergency department nurse who has been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to tampering with consumer products. According to court documents from October 1, 2018 to February 18, 2020, this nurse repeatedly tampered with vials of injectable pain medications, including fentanyl, morphine, hydromorphone, and ketamine, while employed as a registered nurse in the emergency department. She gained access to the medications without authorization and used them herself by using an automated medication dispensing machine. To conceal her scheme, she refilled the vials of medicine with saline solution and superglued the lids back on. She used the saline solution on 30 to 40 unknowing patients who had been admitted to the emergency department and were in need of pain relief. The investigation found that she tampered with between 2 and 7 vials of medicine during each shift that she worked. And finally, the third case I wanted to spotlight involves a registered nurse and nurse practitioner who defrauded commercial health insurers and Medicare of nearly $12 million by devising and executing fraudulent billing schemes in 3 states seeking payment for patient services that were never performed. He has since been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He has pleaded guilty in October 2022 to charges of healthcare fraud, mail fraud, aggravated identity theft, and causing the introduction of misbranded drugs into interstate commerce. He admitted that he routinely submitted fraudulent claims for in-person patient services that he did not perform, including supposed patient visits at a ghost office and at offices throughout the country. He used 7 different tax identification numbers while defrauding 8 insurers out of a total just shy of $12 million. This ghost office was an address that he claimed was part of his medical practice when, in fact, he used that location solely for the purpose of receiving mail, including fraudulently obtained insurance payments. According to documents and information provided to the court, in many instances, patients that he claimed he met with in person were, in fact, was when he was out of the country at the time of those supposed visits. On other occasions, he claimed to have been seeing patients, but those patients were not in the office. As part of his schemes, he waived copayments for some Medicare patients, despite being aware that waiving copayments is prohibited. He did so to induce his patients not to report his fraudulent billing to Medicare. Additionally, he used patient names and information to get prescriptions filled at various pharmacies and which he received. He then distributed those drugs to individuals other than those in whose names the prescriptions were filled. And now it's time for my best practice tips in Trusty Tip. So, in today's compliance tip, let's get into the latest comparative billing report, or CBR, on hospice. And it is CBR number 202304. That's right, it is the 4th CBR for the year for 2023. Now, right now, during the end of April, as I'm recording this episode, CMS will be issuing a comparative billing report, that CBR, to rendering providers that submitted claims for hospice care. Now, this CBR number 202304 focuses on Medicare Part B claims submitted with the modifier GW. That's G as in George, W as in Washington, the modifier GW. Now, this CBR analysis was based on claims extracted from the Integrated Data Repository using the latest version of claims available on March 21st, 2023. Now, the analysis includes paid claims with dates of service from November 1st of 2021 through October 31st of 2022. The 2022 Medicare Fee-for-Service Supplemental Improper Payment Data Report reflects an improper payment rate of 12% for hospice, which represents just under, I hope you're all sitting, just under $3 billion in improper payments. Yeah, I read that number again and again to make sure it wasn't million. It is actually billion. So it represents just under $3 billion in improper payments. Now, the types of error that are comprised in this larger improper payment rate for hospice includes 52% of improper payments attributed to insufficient documentation. And then even further, 39% of an improper payment rate attributed to medical necessity errors. So those are big percentages. 52% attributed to insufficient documentation and 39% attributed to medical necessity errors. Now, after review of and research into the improper payment rate, this CBR was created to analyze the possible threat, of course, to the Medicare Trust Fund associated with hospice care. Now, the expectation is that rendering providers of hospice care will maintain proper coding, documentation procedures, and confirm appropriate use of that modifier GW. G as in George, W as in Washington. Now, the criteria for receiving this particular CBR are that a provider is, number one, significantly higher compared to either peer group or national percentages in any of the 3 metric calculations. So they have to be greater than or equal to the 80th percentile. And then number 2, they have to have had at least 12 beneficiaries with claims during a hospice episode. And finally, third, they had to have had at least $4,200 in total allowed charges. So let's dive into the specifics of why this particular CBR on hospice is issued here. So, of course, let's get into that modifier, GW. Now, if you've been a follower of my podcast since I began 2 years ago, you'll remember that I went over this exact modifier way back in season 2. Now, if we open up our HCPCS Level 2 expert manuals in either 2022 or 2023, the definition is the same. And the GW modifier is used to identify a service that the provider renders to a patient that is not related to the patient's terminal condition. So remember that this GW modifier is used when a provider is not seeing the patient for the terminal condition that they have in the hospice setting. Okay, so that's the main reason why you're being issued this CBR. It's for that modifier. Now, the metrics. This report is an analysis of one metric. It's that percentage of Medicare Part B claims submitted with the modifier GW. So remember that the CBR analysis only focuses on those rendering providers that submitted claims for hospice. The state and national peer groups are defined like this, right? So the state peer group is defined as all rendering Medicare providers in that state with allowed charges for beneficiaries in hospice care. And then the national peer group is defined as all rendering Medicare providers in the nation with allowed charges for beneficiaries in hospice care. So our CBR number 202304 summarizes statistics for services with those dates of service, remember, from November 1, 2021 through October 31st of 2022. And there are exactly 241,430 rendering providers nationwide that submitted Medicare Part B claims with a GW modifier for beneficiaries during hospice care. And the total allowed charges for these claims were over $501 million during that analysis timeframe, right? From November 1, 2021 through October 31st of 2022. And let's be mindful of that hospice care vulnerability, right? Because according to that 2022 Medicare fee-for-service supplemental improper payment data report, right, that improper payment rate is 12% for hospice care services, which represents, again, just under $3 billion in improper payments, of which 52% of those are attributed to insufficient documentation and 39% is attributed to medical necessity errors. And then, of course, remember that the desired behavior for our hospice care providers, right, is definitely to protect the Medicare Trust Fund. We have to make sure that we increase our providers' awareness about improper payments for hospice care services. And this CBR highlights and does a really great job on helping our providers be aware of what is going on in terms of the improper payments that have been going on for quite some time and in quite a volume of improper payments, right? And then, of course, the desired behavior is to definitely support our providers' internal compliance processes. And this CBR definitely provides coding guidelines and requirements. So it's certainly critical to understand that a CBR does not indicate that you are going to get an official audit. But like I've said time and time again on my many, many CBR updates over these 2 years, to please be mindful, because this phrase is directly coming from the MACs that issue the CBRs. So definitely take that with plenty of grains of salt, because more directly, you should consider this to be your notice or your warning that you are certainly being looked at closely. Now, the value of the CBR to providers is that it most certainly serves as a tool to look at your billing patterns as compared to your peers in your state, as well as across the country. And the value also includes the facts that specific coding guidelines and billing information will be detailed. Again, in this case, it's the modifier GW. And then the CBR informs our providers whose billing patterns differ from those of their peers, right? So my best practice recommendations always include to review those CPT codes. And in this case, it's the modifier, right? Definitely be reviewing what the modifier GW is about to ensure correct code assignment. So you should be performing regular internal reviews of your documentation and your code selection to ensure accuracy and compliance. Because these two steps alone, I know, can definitely help reduce the possibility of improper payments. And remember, again, there's that whopping 52% that was attributed to insufficient documentation and another whopping 39% that was due to medical necessity errors. And both of these numbers, in my opinion, are way too high, way too high. So this CBR should have all of us providing hospice care services really buckle down and self-audit whether we received this particular CBR in the mail or not. It's a great time to dive deeper into your own data. So help yourself and help the Medicare Trust Fund at the same time. You should be paying attention to what you're sending out the door. Is it really in compliance? So stay ahead of the curve and avoid receiving post-payment audits from the payer down the road. Because Medicare and all of our Medicare administrative contractors, those MACs, have great fact sheets on hospice modifiers, GV, which is G as in George, V as in Victor, as well as GW, G as in George, W as in Washington. My trusty tip from way back in season 2 highlights them as well. So you really have to know what you're doing when you're applying those two modifiers. And in this particular CBR, they're really putting the spotlight on all of our hospice providers who use that GW modifier, right? So we must understand all of the requirements for maintaining the necessary documentation for hospice care services, because that GW modifier means that the provider is seeing the hospice patient for something unrelated to the hospice care, right? So it's those diagnosis codes and the documentation that have to reflect that as well. What else is going on with that terminally ill patient in hospice care? So documentation must do a better job of painting a more accurate picture, because it's fundamental if you have Medicare as a payer to keep your eye on correct and compliant coding and billing practices and make sure that you are adhering to all of them. A better, smarter approach is one that's proactive and starts by painting a clear, rich, and vibrant medical picture the first time, so your certified medical coder can then abstract codes with accuracy. And finally, I focus Season 8 Spark on creativity. I want this 8th season Spark to be filled with our world's thought leaders, writers, artists, philosophers, everyone who inspires the need for creativity in all we strive to do. So in this week's inspiring quote in Spark is from the amazing surrealist artist Salvador Dalí. Begin by learning to draw and paint like the old masters. After that, you can do as you like. Everyone will respect you. Wow. Absolutely true, right? I think this is an amazing quote that reminds us that yes, we are always taught from the works of those that came before us. In our early years, in our school days, we are enamored with the old masters. We crave their teachings. We want more and more. But somewhere along the way, we feel creative surges take hold within ourselves. I think this quote reminds us that we should embrace that innovation and true creativity that we all possess. It won't arrive at the same time for everyone, but this quote inspires us to take charge and do things our way for our creativity, for our most innovative endeavors. This is the legacy of impact we can leave behind. I'm happy Salvador Dalí's spark burns brightly in all of us today. So that wraps up today's episode. And as always, I appreciate you all diving into today with me. If you want more information from me, please go ahead and follow me on LinkedIn. I'll leave links to everything in the show notes below. Now, I'll write you guys in my final note. I hope you're all staying motivated and positive for your personal and your professional lives. It's the last week of April, so go ahead. Now's the time. Make time for yourself. Try a yoga class or a rock climbing wall session, right? Get on out there. Find some fitness activity that's just to your liking. Now, it's insane to me that the PHE is finally almost over, right? I've been waiting for 3 years. This is never ending. But it's definitely a day that we should celebrate, right? May 11th, 2023 is around the corner and something I'm very much looking forward to. I can't wait to celebrate May 11th. It's going to be a holiday for me, for sure. Anyways, you guys, wishing you all an amazing, amazing day ahead and a very, very happy week as well. Thank you guys so much for listening in on today's episode, and I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.